One.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Daily Objective, brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK. Today, we're going to be talking about something that's very peculiar and interesting to me, but apparently it extends across the objectivist landscape, and that is, what is the attraction of jiu-jitsu for objectivists in particular? Now, I happen to think this martial art is sort of taking the world by storm, and it's fascinating to most people, but I think objectivists have a very unique take on why jiu-jitsu is such an awesome martial art, particularly Brazilian jiu-jitsu. We're not talking traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu. With me today is Seth Levine, fellow martial artist in training, further along the Brazilian jiu-jitsu path than I am due to multiple injuries. But hey, I want to talk about, all the attractions to jiu-jitsu for us respectively, and as objectivists in particular. But what brought you to jiu-jitsu? You tell your story, I'll tell mine.
Yeah, sure. All right, I'll go first. So it's funny, so I'm actually not that good at jiu-jitsu. So I've been training for maybe 3.5 or 4 years or so, something like that. I'm only like a blue belt, which is the second rank. For those who don't know, it goes white, blue, purple, brown, black. So think
wait, there's stripes in white. You gotta lend those stripes in there too.
Yeah. And there's 4 stripes for every belt color, just to mark your progress. So it is it is a very long journey, jiu-jitsu. But it's funny because it's a really it's an interesting community in that there's people who I meet in jiu-jitsu who I would never interact with in my regular life. And people come to jiu-jitsu, I find, for different reasons. So how I got involved in martial arts goes back to my early 20s. I had always lifted weights in college. I started working out when I was 16. Never looked good. I would just kind of go in and do the generic gym thing, weightlifting thing. I do back and buys one day, chest and tries, but I had no idea what I was doing. I looked terrible, wasn't that strong. And then when I in my early 20s, I was working in New York City. I was like, you know what, I've had enough lifting weights. I'd like to play a sport. That would be a good way for fitness. I was interested in fitness. But playing a sport in New York City is almost impossible. So I kind of came to the idea of hey, what about boxing? So I started looking for boxing gyms, and lo and behold, there was a kickboxing gym called Muay Thai, which is a Thai style of kickboxing, near where I lived. So I joined and I started doing Muay Thai. I thought, I'm not into this stuff. But anyway, started doing Muay Thai. It was a great workout. Loved doing it. And I did it for about 10 years over a 15-year period until I hit my mid to late 30s, when I was you know what, had enough of this banging around, it's just punching and striking, right? I've had enough getting kind of banging around. I really am interested in increasing my mobility. So in my gym had a couple other it was a big gym, it's a great gym, had a couple other styles there, and I would always see the jiu-jitsu guys kind of squirming around on the mat there. I was that looks kind of cool as I get older. I'm not really into the closeness of the intimacy of jiu-jitsu and sweating on other people. But I like the idea of being able to roll around on my back and roll over people and just have the mobility that jiu-jitsu players seem to have, especially as I get older. And anyway, I went over and I actually ended up doing judo first for 2 years, which just destroyed me because it was just a lot of throws and getting too old. And then I finally moved after an injury. I finally moved over to jiu-jitsu, and I've been doing it ever since. And it's kind of lived up to to my expectations of really increasing my mobility and my kind of body awareness. Wonder what your experience was, Mark.
Yeah, so I also had a pretty long martial arts experience. I'd been training at the Jet Center with some pro trainers for about 3 or 4 years. And Muay Thai boxing, if anybody knows it or has involved themselves in it for any length of time, you have to understand it's a brutal sport and it brutalizes your body. So it would take me about 30 minutes when I got out of bed to get all the aches and pains out of my body, and then I'd go redo it again at the Jet Center. And then I decided I wanted to try a martial art that would be I'd have a little more longevity. And so I went back to Taekwondo, which I had originally studied as a kid, but never finished. And I wanted to get my black belt. So I started studying at Jun Chong, and then I started training privately with this crazy martial artist, amazing martial artist. And round about my 2-stripe red belt period, which is right before black, I decided I wanted to mix up my routine a little bit. So I invited this Division I wrestler friend over to my classes afterwards, and he and I would wrestle. And then I happened to work on a movie called Lethal Weapon 3, and the stunt coordinator on Lethal Weapon 3 was the great Horian Gracie. Now, nobody knew who the Gracies were at the time, because this was about 91, 92. I forget when the movie was made, but way before the Gracies were a household name. And he started talking about this great system of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I saw the stuff they were doing. It looked so crazy and weird. I just wanted to be a part of it. So he invited me to their studio in Torrance. And so I went there, and of course he was talking about, we're going to bring these Brazilian jungle fights where people of all different martial arts got together and they fought, like, with no rules. We're going to bring it there to America. You'll see. I didn't believe him, of course. This was way before UFC. But of course, his brother Preuss became one of the first UFC world champions and was my trainer for a while. We trained in these small classes. But I injured my back very badly after about 2 months, sparring, on your knees with a blue belt at the time, who messed up my back. And that put me out of jiu-jitsu for a number of years until I restarted again with Marcus Vinicius at Beverly Hills Jiu-Jitsu. Now, I am even lower than you, my friend. I am a 2-stripe white belt, but I tested for my blue. Unbeknownst to me, my teacher didn't tell me I was having a test. And at the time, I had a heart condition and a back issue. And I was thinking more about that stuff than 10 variations on techniques. And so I was only able to come up with 5 each thing. And so I didn't pass my blue belt test, but I am dying to get back into it and get at least the purple belt, because you're saying blue belt isn't much, but I'll tell you what, one of the things that I love about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is I knew a lot of black belts in Taekwondo who couldn't fight. I could kick their asses when I was a green belt. But when you're a blue belt, when you start getting colors in your belts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, one thing is for sure: you can defend yourself on the ground. There's no question about it. You can get out of anything any normal person's going to throw at you on the ground. You're pretty good with defending yourself at, and I can't say that about systems of Taekwondo. So it is a superior system of, especially ground fighting, nothing better in the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. So like what, kind of curious, like what brought you into jiu-jitsu? Because how I look at jiu-jitsu, there's basically, I think, one of 2 things that kind of bring people in, and jiu-jitsu is it's unique in a sense. I think it shares this with like Muay Thai, for example, but jiu-jitsu is a kind of a martial art that is combat effective, but also a sport. Right. So you can't really say that about too many other things. Like there are, like, I guess, like sport karate and sport taekwondo that have made it a sport out of it. Wrestling, for example, is like, it's solely a sport, even though some wrestlers would be very good in a fight. It's not necessarily a fighting style. Maybe Muay Thai and boxing probably share that too, where it's a fight and a sport. But like for me, like what brought me into jiu-jitsu, like I was never interested in fighting per se or self-defense. Like I was very much drawn to it as like a workout and playing a sport. And like, just so happens that like, the self-defense aspect for me is like, it's just gravy. So I'm kind of curious what brought you on.
Self-defense.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up in a very toxic household with a stepfather who was a very unpredictable, scary person. That left me with a sense of insecure, like a base level of insecurity about the world, and felt very unsafe in his presence all the time from a very young person until my mom finally divorced him. So the idea that I would gain enough knowledge to defend myself against a creep like that was what motivated me to do martial arts at all. And you're right. Many of them are solely sport, solely for exercise, even though they claim to be martial arts, but very few of them, I think wrestling, boxing, Muay Thai, and Jiu-Jitsu in particular, can actually be applied in the real world, which is one of the things I think attracts us objectivists to, is applicability to real life.
Yeah, I think that's a good maybe transition to like what makes it so, I mean, as you notice, like it's so popular. But I guess why is it popular? And I guess what maybe might an objectivist have a unique opinion on why it's so popular? I mean, I have my opinions. If you have yours, I'd
yeah,
say.
But you said something that was really great, and I don't want to jump on it as if it's mine,
Okay.
because it's right in the front of my consciousness. So you say it first, because I thought it was great.
Sure. Like one thing, what really also has kept me going with jiu-jitsu is not just the workout, because it is like I will work out in jiu-jitsu like nothing else. Like it kind of checks all the fitness boxes. Like I leave dripping sweat, but just exhausted. It's kind of like a HIIT workout, like high intensity interval training, because like you're kind of moving in fits and spurts and in these short time periods. But one thing that just fascinates me is the cognitive aspect of it. And I find jiu-jitsu to be extremely inductive, which is different than a lot of other martial arts that are deductive. Now, what do I mean by that? Like jiu-jitsu is, so if you look at some other martial arts, let's straw man this instead of steel man. Let's straw man this with like with an absurd image of like an ancient kung fu master. Right. And I'm just kind of like stylizing this. The way how a lot of other martial arts are is it gets passed down from the master. The master has all the knowledge, and then he teaches, or she teaches his students. So it is almost like received wisdom, almost like a religion in that sense. There's the master or the God with all the wisdom, and we are just here to accept it. Jiu-jitsu is very different. Jiu-jitsu, and the way how jiu-jitsu started, and I'm happy to kind of go down the history of that for anyone who's interested, is it started as an inductive martial art. It was, hey, here's this, we want to devise the best way to fight. Like you said, Mark, it was a bunch of Brazilian guys. That's the sort of short history of it, but it extends back actually to Japan, as jiu-jitsu would probably lead you to believe, who are just interested in devising the best way to fight. And unlike other martial arts, jiu-jitsu is very much an alive sport. It is constantly evolving. There are constantly new techniques and new ways to approach jiu-jitsu, both in sport and self-defense, that makes it that I think separates it from other deductive kind of martial arts, where this is very much inductive. So even I don't know if you'd agree, but I hear a lot of black belts talk about, hey, like your jiu-jitsu journey just begins when you get your black belt, because now you finally have enough skills where you could start experimenting with other techniques and figuring other stuff out. So in other words, the body of jiu-jitsu knowledge is not fixed, but it is an ever-expanding kind of pie.
Yeah, and for anybody who doubts that, all you have to do is go to that UFC 1, watch a great teacher like Royce Gracie, dominate everybody with 3 techniques, and then go fast forward 30 years later and watch the extreme evolution of the techniques. It has literally picked apart every potential scenario that a person could confront, and it figures out a way to get around that. And you could also see that through Brenner Gracie's videos that he posts often with his wife, where they will take a real life scenario where, say, a woman gets beaten up in an elevator, can't move, or she gets kidnapped and pulled into a van, and they show you multiple ways to deal with that situation. That particular situation. Now, there's no self-defense class in the world that could give you that. There's no formal martial arts system that I know of that could give you that. And when you talk about that deductive system, I remember, first of all, your techniques they come down from a particular master whom you revere, and you learn the techniques through a thing called katas, which are, stylized movements. It's sort of like a dance. It has a very specific number of moves. The higher up you go, the more sophisticated the moves get. And that's how you learn what you learn. And even when you learn self-defense techniques, it's very much frozen and rigid, in the way, exactly the opposite of what's going to happen to you in real life situation. And there's nothing like that in Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. It's all very dynamic and decentralized, as you said. Even though it comes from the Gracies, the most famous family, there's other families I think that are famous as well. It's still sort of decentralized in that whoever invents that new thing can invent it and add to that pool of knowledge. It's pretty cool.
It's pretty cool, especially if you go back and watch like matches over the past, I would say even particularly the past 10 years or so. So I would say that jiu-jitsu is probably popularized by the UFC and Pride and basically MMA, mixed martial arts. But now you've seen the development of jiu-jitsu into its own sporting categories that are, admittedly smaller than MMA, but something like the ADCC tournament, which is held every 2 years. And it's probably one of the most prestigious jiu-jitsu tournaments out there. Another one would be the IBJJF, they have a couple tournaments a year. But if you watch who is winning with what techniques, go to the ADC. Let's just talk about the ADCC for a while. What techniques are winning in the ADCC over the past few years past decade, let's say, have completely changed. Like there was a period of, 5 years, not even 5 years ago, probably like 3 or 4 years ago, where if you could, leg lockers were winning. And what a leg lock is basically just a way to break someone's knee. A lot of jiu-jitsu.
Dude, that's still very scary, man. Guys that can roll into a leg lock, that's scary. You can't tap fast enough for that shit.
It is extremely scary. And unlike an arm lock, for example, your legs don't give you any. There's not a lot of give on your knee, where there's some give on your elbow, for example. But people have figured out how to defend leg locks, where there was a time where everyone was winning in a leg lock. You see someone grab someone's leg and it'd be like an instant tap. Now people have figured out how to kind of navigate them a little bit more, and they're becoming less popular as a finishing technique, not because they're not effective, but just because the sport and the body of knowledge has evolved and grown over the past couple of years, where now people have to figure out, kind of the next thing. It is like jiu-jitsu is very much like an arms race in that way, where again, you don't see that in any other, in a lot of other martial arts, for example.
Yeah, and I think the UFC, it's always had that inductive edge to it. It's always been inventive, but the UFC sort of accelerated that invention, right? It's like that spiral of knowledge thing that happens once we start allowing it to progress. It's like the UFC gets in there, and now these jiu-jitsu guys are confronted with these scenarios that they probably didn't think of before, and even in these, high submission games where it's just jiu-jitsu, you're just grappling, they're getting confronted with all these scenarios. They're like, now, how do I apply my mind to this problem to get out of that? Because I'm going to find myself there. So what do we do?
Yeah. And one thing too, that I'm seeing a lot in jiu-jitsu is there's a change in the style. Now I've only been doing jiu-jitsu maybe for 4 years, but the style of teaching has changed in jiu-jitsu, where it used to be, again, go to other martial arts. It used to be focused on technique. Today we're going to do a cross-side armbar, right? Today we are going to do strike, this type of strike, this type of kata, as Mark described earlier. But now you're seeing people say, all right, let's say you're in this position. How do you finish it or so? It's become a lot more, it's almost like a buzzword that I think a lot of people, it's lost on a lot of people, but maybe has a more, more alive word for objectivists. It's become, people are starting to teach jiu-jitsu in concepts as opposed to technique.
Yes, this is a new thing. This is something I've noticed over the last couple of years.
This is completely new, where now it's not, okay, let's say you have someone and you're holding someone's back. Now you put your right arm on his left shoulder, and then you put your left foot over his head, and then you go and you spin around, you grab this. It's, whereas you're being prescribed a set of instructions that you must follow. Now, the way how jiu-jitsu is starting to be taught, it's not there yet, but certain schools and certain people and certain practitioners are experimenting with it, where it's like, okay, the submission, let's say I want to get someone an arm bar. What kind of positional control do I need on that person in order to get that person an arm bar? Right. So now you're starting people to sort of experiment and explore what exactly an arm bar is and what you need to control. And then there's a big variability in terms of how you get there. So if you want to put someone in an arm bar, and for those who don't know, it's an arm bar is a breaking of the elbow with someone's hips. Basically, that means you have to have, in order to break someone's elbow, you need to have control over their wrist and their shoulder. So how do you get control of someone's wrist and shoulder? And while there's almost an infinite amount of positions that you can, get someone in order to have to execute the same arm bar, but it would not be the exact same arm bar for every person.
Yeah, I mean, I can't gush enough about what an innovation this is to martial arts teaching, because when I was doing jiu-jitsu, it would be, you'd learn one or two techniques and you'd go through that through half the class. You'd roll around with those techniques, and then the last half you just roll with people, right? You'd pretty much apply whatever you knew in the moment to whatever you were confronted with for the last half hour, which could also be very disastrous if you're a white belt and you're working with other white belts, because people don't know what they're doing, and you end up getting hurt. But this idea that it's very much the way you should pretty much teach everything. It provides a context for a technique, so you're not learning it piecemeal and then taking years to integrate that into a whole system. You're learning systemic knowledge right off the bat. So it's like, and I think I'm right in saying the Gracies do this with a thing called Gracie Essentials, where you instead of having to flood your mind that crow epistemology with 8,000 techniques, you learn 32 ways of doing things that kind of slip into, in a flow-like way, pretty much all the things you need to do. Yeah, and that is that's epistemologically compact, very good for your mind. It'll enable you to get out of almost any situation if you can absorb those wider fundamentals.
Yeah, unit economy. We have some super chats coming in, so why don't we get to those? Hey Mark, this one's for you from Apollo Zeus. Thank you for your £2 contribution. Mark, anecdotes on Oleg Taktarov?
Yeah, Oleg Taktarov, who was also a UFC champion, was also one of my acting students, and he was a Russian Sambo champion. He's got the head the size of a grizzly bear. But he's super nice guy. Except all the acting teachers except for me were afraid of him. Now I wasn't not afraid of him because I was tough. I knew he wouldn't hurt me or anything because he could. But I remember one day, he would sort of do whatever he wanted in class, and all the other teachers wouldn't confront him because they're afraid of him. Then one day I sort of requested that he do something, and he didn't do it. And I stopped him and I said, "Oh, here's the deal. If I want to learn how to fight, you're the boss in the ring. All right? Guess what? This is my ring. I'm the boss." And the light bulb went off like this with him. And he, from then on, he was like my student.
That's awesome.
He's a really sweet guy.
All right. We got another one from Catherine Cassio. Sorry if I'm pronouncing you guys' names wrong. Reading is not my specialty. Thanks for the very cool topic. Well, I'm glad you enjoy it, Catherine. Catherine with another $4.99 says, protecting yourself is honoring yourself. Selfishness in the best way. I would definitely agree with that. And then we have Christopher Smith, $2.99 Canadian, just contribution. Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for your super chats, everyone. But yeah, I think there's another sort of interesting aspect too about jiu-jitsu from an objectivist kind of perspective is it's a very what's the right word? Reality oriented martial art. So one thing that is always funny to me is, you see like a child with a black belt, for example, if you go to like Taekwondo or karate, these are very popular activities for children to do. And, you do it for a few years and then they have a black belt. Now, a black belt basically connotes some kind of mastery. But like me, as like, let's just say I came up across a 10-year-old, let's say I did no training. I wouldn't feel very intimidated by if there were a fight. I'm not picking fights with someone, but like I wouldn't really feel like a child black belt would be sort of as physically threatening or capable of defending themselves against an untrained, unarmed adult, because just the difference in physical size is real. Like it almost ignores the difference between an adult, the physical attributes, and even mental too, between a child and an adult. And what's cool about jiu-jitsu is jiu-jitsu has a 2-belt system, one for children and one for adults. Basically, until you're 15 years old, it's either 15 or 16. Don't quote me on it, but it's definitely 15 or 16. You basically have to go through the children's progression of belt systems. And it doesn't mean these kids are unskilled. They are highly skilled, probably way more skilled than I am. But what it does recognize, that is it recognizes the reality of a situation where there is a difference in physicality between an adult and a child. Once you're 15, then you can move on to the adult system of belting that I described earlier. And that is unique, I think, to jiu-jitsu. I mean, it may not be, but as far as I know, I don't know of too many other martial arts that sort of differentiate between, that sort of look at the difference between a child and an adult and separate them. And I think that comes back to Marcus, as you were saying before, the way in which jiu-jitsu was formed, which was it was formed from fighting.
Right. So I tend to agree with you there. Also, I feel like in jiu-jitsu, the belt levels represent something very true, whereas in other martial arts, that's not necessarily the case. Perfect example. The guy I trained with privately was an amazing technician. He was a Hapkido black belt and a Taekwondo black belt, all army champion. He was one of the best kickers I've ever seen in my life. He had a dojang in Inglewood, and he would have a black belt class. Now the black belts weren't his black belts, but he invited me into the class from the time I was a green belt, and it was a black belt sparring class. So there were mostly guys from the system, the Jinchong system. They weren't trained by him, but I was being trained by him. And it was a real mixed bag. I mean, most of the black belts could not fight. And if they were his black belts, they could, but most of those black belts could not. However, if you say you have a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there is no doubt. There's no doubt in anybody's mind that you know what you're doing. And even if you say you have a purple belt, that's very formidable. Because purple belts will tap black belts sometimes. In the mixed martial arts world, they'll tap a black belt. There's a vast array of skill difference between the two in a way. But once you hit that level of purple belt, you have a degree of flow and command over your techniques and mat generalship that is really you really can't find in the lower ranks, and is distinguished by that belt level. And no other martial art that I know of really does that. You pass a test, a formal test, you get a certificate in the other ranks, doesn't mean anything. This, it does.
Yeah,
for sure.
That's kind of interesting too. Like, I don't know how your gym is, but there is sort of like a playful and joyful, almost informality, at least how my gym is and a couple other places, in terms of how you are presented with different rank or promotions of rank. Whereas like, it's almost like sprung upon you in a lot of ways. And it's kind of fun and it's joyful. And I think it's I think there's like a life lovingness aspect to that. Like, for example, like I didn't really know when or if I was going to get promoted. Like we had like a promotion ceremony, which maybe the only time I've kind of seen it in my gym, because it's just kind of small. But like normally it's just like, and guess what's happening today? And like people find like fun ways of like presenting it, like presenting people with belt ranks. And this is true if you watch some of the jiu-jitsu tournaments, and you look at the competitors. So even the competitors in jiu-jitsu will compete at different belt levels. So there'll be blue belt competitions, and there'll be purple belt competitions, and brown belts and black belts and open. And that is to, again, sort of segregate skill level. But often, or occasionally, what you'll see is someone will win in their division maybe once or twice, and then like the coach will just show up and like present the person with like a belt. It's like, it's such a cool, I think like almost there's like a joy in that promotion process, that is shared by both the teacher and the student. And it's not like a formal test where it's like, hey, congratulations, but it's more of just a recognition of reality and sort of wanting to share in that joy with people. Now, of course, that I'm sure that's not universal, but it definitely is, it's definitely not a singular occurrence that I've come across.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you pay a testing fee, you go in and test in front of the masters of the school, and then if you pass, you get this certificate, and you get a little belt ceremony in your class in the martial arts that I used to do. And definitely, I remember getting my stripes, in the beginning of or end of class, and being shocked and proud that I was able to achieve that little movement in that art. Yeah, so it's much more informal but reflective of your skills, as opposed to you just had a good day that day. This is an accumulation of somebody seeing that your experience is actually at that level.
Yeah, it is like a concretization of conceptual knowledge. Right? It's almost like an art form in a sense. It's a metaphysical reminder of the amount of conceptual knowledge you hold in your brain about jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, man, it's awesome. I can't sing its praises enough. Did we miss anything? So it's an inductive way of approaching martial arts, which for objectivists is awesome, right? We think that's the way to knowledge. It's definitely a better integration than the deductive form of repeating or by rote way that other martial arts inculcate their techniques. It's very practical. It's like our philosophy. Philosophy is for living, and martial arts is for being able to defend yourself in pretty much any situation. So it's very practical. That's very appealing. It's strategic, which appeals to our mind as well. You're figuring out problems all the way through. You should be figuring out problems all the way through. A lot of martial arts, practical martial arts like Muay Thai or boxing, have a similar kind of strategic approach, a reality-centered approach, but not quite as, I think, holistic as the Brazilian model of martial arts.
Yes,
Right, we like that the belt system and the promotion system reflect reality and the accumulation of actual conceptual knowledge.
I would say it's even ever expanding, and you see jiu-jitsu traditionally was fought in a gi, which kind of also reflects the Japanese heritage of like of what people wore back in the day, whereas like now you see what's called no gi, which is just basically spandex. That's the fancy name for spandex. Kind of like wrestling, it's evolved. The sport evolves, right? It's evolving with time and taste, but still applying the same kind of concepts to the sport. And again, the sport is also, like you said, the sport is practical, and it's tested, and it's living, and it's evolving. I think lastly, it's that it's joyful. It definitely is a joyful art, activity, even no matter how hard and grueling and punishing it can be. In the end of the day, I think people love it because I don't think we said this, it is a mind-body integration. And that's kind of how I hold it too. Like jiu-jitsu is a mind-body integration. It's not just about who's stronger, who's faster, who's more physically gifted, but you also have to have that big mental aspect of it. So, it's not even just like who's smarter. too. Like, who knows more jujitsu? You have to be able to integrate your mind with your body and your movements. So I think
I don't necessarily think that's unique to jiu-jitsu. I think that's in any sport. You have to be, even in working out properly, I think you have to have a mind-body integration. And the purpose of learning new things, even if you're doing dynamic workouts, is to connect the two of them, keep you young. But I think jiu-jitsu does, I don't want to say it's like that. That's the forward foot of jiu-jitsu, but it's certainly an aspect of it that makes it great. Yeah,
for sure. Now we have another super chat came in from Apollo Zeus. Thank you for the £2. BJJ versus catch wrestling. You have a view? I'll take it. So catch wrestling, for those who don't know, catch wrestling was like the precursor to kind of fake WWE wrestling of today. Back in, I don't know, the early, late 1800s, you would have actual wrestling matches, and it was called catch wrestling, where the idea was like to wrestle the person and get them to submit. Jiu-jitsu was actually developed in no small part because of catch wrestling. Now, the origins of jiu-jitsu are a little bit, I don't want to say sketchy, but it is nebulous in a little bit. Whereas jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu today, basically it comes from, I'll just go through real quick, but basically comes from Japanese jiu-jitsu, and Japanese jiu-jitsu is a broad term. And it really began with how samurais would fight when they were knocked from their horses and lost their weapons. So it was all about battlefield warfare with your hands unarmed. Very grueling, like eye gouges, groin strikes, whatever. Fast forward a couple of years, the guy Kano, I forget his last name, but the guy who developed judo, he basically saw jiu-jitsu, distilled it down into techniques that were safe to practice, and put it and called it judo. Since then, judo, and he went out and taught. He brought this to the Japanese world in the 1800s. And he would just go, and they would have these dojo storms, which are just like gyms would fight each other all the time, and like Kano's guys would kill everyone, even though they were doing less deadly techniques. Because they were doing less deadly techniques, they were actually able to practice them in live situations, and that became more important to winning than sort of doing these katas, as Mark described. Judo has morphed since then, but anyway, around that time period, one of his students, again, forget his name, Maeda, I believe, kind of toured the world to kind of show judo, take judo to the world. And he was doing a lot of catch wrestling. He was up against a lot of catch wrestlers in like fairgrounds because they were putting on these exhibition fights. And he's the one who's sort of credited with developing the precursors to Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And in Maeda's travels, stumbled across the Gracies in Brazil, taught them to not Carlos, but he ended up teaching them to I forget two Gracies, Carlos and Helio. Forget his father's name. His father was I think a plantation owner, and was like, hey, teach my sons this. And then from Carlos and Helio, they sort of devised Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Brazilian jiu-jitsu. They're credited with kind of founding that whole system and the whole sport. Sometimes called Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. They're kind of synonymous, but they founded the sport, and a lot of that was involved through these fights, like that involved a lot of catch wrestling. So catch wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, regular wrestling, judo, it's all sort of intertwined in this big tent that we call sort of, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, because as Mark and I have discussed, jiu-jitsu is this living thing. And really the goal of it is sort of to win a fight or win a sports competition as it is today under a rule set that simulates sort of fights. I don't know if you have anything to add. Otherwise, we got a few more super chats that came in.
No, that was good.
All right. So we got equal to reality, BJJ or Japanese jiu-jitsu. for 2 pounds. So I think I just sort of covered that a little bit there in that.
Well, I used to do Kodokan Jiu-Jitsu, which is a form of traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. And my teacher is now an 8th degree black belt. And I think a solid brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu could submit him. And he's great. He was great.
Yeah.
But,
and again, I think that goes back to the training style. And I guess it's more than just a training style. It's the philosophy of the art, where it was, one is like, hey, we're going to learn the most deadliest strikes and the most deadliest techniques in the world. The other one, that would be the traditional kata Japan martial arts, whatever it is, versus the sort of other philosophy that, again, is I credit to judo, just based on a book or two that I've read, is, hey, we want to be able to, we recognize in order to be effective, you have to train it, which means we can't do all the deadly things possible. So we need to distill it down into a certain amount of techniques that you could still, hurt someone with, kill them with, or whatever, are very, very functional from a martial perspective, fighting perspective. But we have to be able to train, because that's really a big part of the value. It's not just the technique, but knowing how to use it.
Yeah, and I just want to say, when I studied Kodokan Jiu-Jitsu, I was 18 years. I was a teenager, so that was many, many years ago. I don't know if the style has evolved or is on the same course as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But if it is, great. It's I wouldn't poo-poo it. It had a lot of good stuff in it.
Yeah. All right, some more super chats coming in. So free trade for 100 Swedish kroner. Isn't the lack of striking techniques in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu a problem in that it doesn't condition you to being hit? I practice some other karate where you really learn to take a beating. Still heaps of fun. I would say, that is, I guess, if you want to look as a full fighting system, that is maybe a flaw. Particularly today. If you go back to the early UFC days, like UFC was developed as a as a pressure cooker for, let's find out which martial art is the best, right? We're going to just put no rules, no hold bars, go. And I think the idea behind jiu-jitsu is that every fight ends in the most fight end up on the ground anyway. So if you could kind of take it to the ground, you have a big advantage. But I think, if you look at mixed martial arts today, like kind of to your point, free trade, is that there are no pure jiu-jitsu players, right? In order to sort of win a fight, which MMA, I think, does the best job at simulating, you have to have a little bit, you have to be proficient in sort of everything. And I think, maybe jiu-jitsu is just the, one of the best, ground positional games or styles out there.
I don't know how to I don't really know how to respond to that. There is something to learning how to take a punch, and there's also something to, it doesn't matter how well you can take a punch if you're on the ground and the guy submits you and chokes you out. If he can get past you. The main thing is to be able to assert yourself in the moment and not fight the other guy's fight. And if you're a karate guy, then he'll taking you to the ground. He just has to get by you a little bit. And with a lot of karate guys, to be honest, there's some really great karate guys that are hard to get through. Most folks out there that are trained in dojos in America aren't so hard. They're not so hard.
Yeah, and two, there's another aspect I think to it of, so like I still remember like very starkly, like the first time I took a punch doing Muay Thai without flinching. Like I remember it. It's so weird that that's such an important moment in my life, because there is something to the confidence of not flinching, especially when you're in a fighting context of it, where it's, you are able to keep your awareness. But, I think there's an aspect to, in a stand-up fight or competition, call it, there is a, like, luck comes in way, there's a greater degree of luck, I think, in that type of context than it is if you can take a fight to the ground. Like anyone could sort of, not anyone, but like, it's much easier to get, there's a higher probability of someone getting hit and knocked out by some kind of like random sort of strike than there is of anyone getting randomly submitted on the ground, in any context, right? It's just, I'll just leave it at that. Yeah. It's what you're not going to randomly choke someone out. You're not going to randomly kind of put someone in an armbar and break their elbow. You're not going to randomly blow out someone's knees. Where you can almost randomly, lucky shot. That's the word. You can, like, someone could get lucky and just get a lucky shot and hit you in the right spot and knock you out. And I think that goes
The
back
hardest.
to
I'll tell you what. The hardest I've ever been punched was a guy who hit me barely at all. He just turned the punch over at the very end, boom, like this. Hit me right in the sweet spot, and I didn't get knocked out, but I was on Queer Street. Like, it doesn't, it's not about getting hit hard, it's about getting hit right.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
all right,
anyway,
John.
I don't know that answered his question. I do think there's a value to, like you said, being able to weather the storm and sit in the pocket and not freak out. I mean, that's the main thing, or not freak out when you're in some pain, like to be able to walk through that a little bit. There is some value to that. So I don't know if that's a weak spot in jiu-jitsu. I wouldn't know if that's a weak spot.
But I mean, I guess if you look at the UFC, right, or any of the MMA competitions, no one is just a pure jiu-jitsu player. They do other, they do train and stand up, but there is definitely, you need jiu-jitsu. I think you need jiu-jitsu to win one, to be in these fighting competitions where, at a higher degree than I think you need some of the other strikes, some of the other sort of aspects.
But in the street, I think it's valuable to be able to keep your composure and not overreact to stuff that's coming at you, because reflexively you overreact to things that are coming into your face, as opposed to keeping, level. And so there is a value to learning how to keep your composure and see what's going on in front of you instead of losing sight all the time and panicking.
And that is also a big part of the jiu-jitsu development too, right? There's a big mental aspect to it of when you're just rolling with people, which is the slang term for sparring or wrestling on the ground. You're in like really awful positions and like really terrible. Like you want to, like, it's claustrophobic. You're either getting choked or you're getting like smashed, or it's just awful. And you really have to learn and condition yourself to kind of stay calm under pressure. And, that is, you get that in other sports too. Like, again, like Muay Thai, like I learned how to kind of take a punch, but I think the composure aspect of it is, it's to a different degree in jiu-jitsu. So anyway, Jonathan, thank you for your $1.99 super chat. Mark, I don't know if you have anything else to say. Otherwise, we can. I think we covered a lot of ground here on jiu-jitsu. I can talk about it all day. I'm sure you can too.
Yeah.
You want to close us out?
Yes. I mean, I don't have announcements there. So if you have if Daniel has any announcements, either he wants to do them himself or pass them on to you. But yeah, it was very stimulating for me. Awesome talking with you about it. I look forward to getting upcoming announcements. Good. I look forward to getting back on the mat again. And maybe one of these days we could get some objectivists on a mat together with Alex Epstein, and he could give a class and we could roll a little bit.
He could submit us all by leaps and bounds. Well,
yeah, yes, he could. But hey, it would be fun anyway. All right, folks, thanks for joining us on this today's episode of the Daily Objective, brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK. Remember to always check your premises, and peace, folks.
Take care.